Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to those of you who've been to these events before and to those of you who are new to the London lectures. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening the first speaker of 2023 in our Words and Worlds series, Dr. Andrew Hines. He has a PhD in comparative literature, and he's now lecturer in world philosophies at SOAS, University of London. From 2020 to 2022, he was the Thyssen Research Fellow at the Centre for Anglo-German Cultural Relations at QMUL. He's a specialist in intellectual history and questions relating to language, figurative thought, and the understanding. His first book was Metaphor in European Philosophy After Nietzsche, and his forthcoming book, Communication Breakdown, Misunderstanding in the Public Use of Reason, will be published by Bloomsbury later this year. And Andrew's talk tonight is entitled Misunderstanding and Meaning. Andrew.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. Thank you so much to the Royal Institute for your invitation. It's an enormous honor and pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of you for coming out on a very cold January night. If you're like me, I think the risk of things on Eventbrite is that you tend to click book and think, perhaps I'll go to that. And then suddenly the night comes and you're like, oh, I can't be bothered. So it's a real pleasure. So thank you for actually coming out tonight. Well, the purpose of this talk is to reflect on a relationship between two concepts, misunderstanding and meaning. And aside from the fact that I think it's really intellectually interesting, this relationship, I believe these two concepts have an urgency for us today. Because both misunderstanding and the changes to the meaning of key concepts has been a prominent, disorienting, and abiding feature in public life over the last 10 years. The terms post-truth, fake news, have made their way into headlines, our vocabularies, even our dictionaries. And when we use these terms, the related issue of misunderstanding is not far from our minds. The connotation is that a person or a particular group seems to somehow willfully or is simply ignorant and misunderstands, buying into a false information and misunderstanding the facts. Thinkers like Steven Pinker even demand enlightenment now in their book titles. If the bestseller list during Trump's presidency and the Brexit vote in this country are to have been any kind of indication, there's a belief that people are being intentionally misled, that misunderstandings have been produced ideologically, akin to propaganda, and old classics reflecting on this experience of fascism in 20th century Europe made their way back. So I can remember even a few years ago, Hannah Arendt's Origin of Totalitarianism and Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here were in the lobby downstairs of this very bookstore. Now, as the initial shock of populist politics has kind of stumbled into the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, not to mention the intensifying situation responding to global warming, the UK's own energy, economic, and forthcoming services crisis, permacrisis is not simply the word of the year for this past year, but it's a lived reality. And while the keen observer may note that there is obviously a difference between populist politics, COVID-19, and the energy crisis, what unifies them is a fissure of meaning within public discourse about these issues. So tonight, it's my contention that the way that fissure has taken place leads to new types of misunderstanding. So this project tonight begins with the assumption that the way in which human cognition processes misunderstanding has changed. This is for two reasons. First, as outlined above, the meanings of key terms such as democracy, by which we judge a misunderstanding, have shifted, alongside shifts in cultural and political identity. And while we've been deeply aware of these cultural and political shifts, the accompanying shifts to the meaning of language that accompany them often happen without us noticing. That's the first reason. Secondly, the technology through which we process meaning and create judgments, such as social media, has shifted. We're not fully aware that our minds are processing and judging misunderstanding differently. So let me begin with how I think we often think of misunderstanding. So we often think of misunderstanding, I think, in terms of a failure of understanding. It's a word I'll come back to a lot tonight. For example, when Gina Miller took a case to the High Court challenging the government's ability to trigger Article 50, she was labeled as a traitor to democracy. And the judges that ruled in her favor labeled as enemies of the people. Miller was very confused by this. She believed her actions were an attempt to protect democracy, as she said in several interviews. We might say that her critics simply failed to understand the nature of representative democracy in this country. And while it's quite apparent that there have been clear failures of understanding on public display in Western democracies of the last 10 years that do signal worrying misunderstandings, my question tonight is this: what is the understanding that has been missed? Rather than simply a failure of understanding, I would argue that there are in fact three contemporary conceptions of misunderstanding today that we indiscriminately cluster under the same word. Today, misunderstanding can mean a failure of understanding something rightly. It can also mean a relative misunderstanding between two different paradigms. Or it can mean an ideological production where our colloquial language is used against us. However, none of these three seem to speak precisely to the clash of meanings we see today. Two different understandings of the same thing within the same paradigm. So, if this is the case, then my argument tonight that we misunderstand misunderstanding, and that it is itself a concept that needs critical reflection, I would argue that the way in which we typically invoke that term hasn't actually changed much since 1689 in the publication of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. We have a very old concept and a very simple concept of misunderstanding. And while concepts in Western philosophy like understanding, comprehension, and meaning have all gone through a significant shift and a significant change from the early modern period until now, misunderstanding has changed hardly at all. As a result, our concept of what it means to misunderstand something isn't suited to the task of providing us with critical insight in our particular historical moment. So I'm going to divide this talk into three sections. The first thing I'd like to do tonight is, as I've outlined above, critique the popular conception of misunderstanding. The second thing I'd like to reflect on is, as the title of this talk suggests, the relationship between misunderstanding and meaning, and in particular, the changes to meaning. Just as we misjudge what kind of a misunderstanding occurs in our historical moment, we also misjudge the type of meaning change occurring. And finally, I'll reflect on, in conclusion, if misunderstanding is indeed tied to meaning change, what does this tell us about the phenomenon of misunderstanding itself? So, misunderstanding. I want to provide some historical reflections to get going on the concept of misunderstanding. Part of my own philosophical background is in European philosophy, and there's an interesting presupposition about misunderstanding in the discipline of hermeneutics, which begins in Germany in the 18th century. Misunderstanding, it is said, is not a rarefied thing. Rather, it's a matter of course. The goal, then, of the discipline of hermeneutics is to provide an art of achieving understanding. This was, of course, a tactic that was developed in Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries as the art of reading and interpreting ancient texts and sacred texts, and it was closely related with the interpretation of the Christian Bible. Part of the reason early hermeneutics asserted that misunderstanding was a matter of course has to do with the spatial and emotional distance between the reader and an ancient text. And that distance creates a gap of meaning. So it was in a lot of ways an early foray into that sociological concept you might be familiar with of distinctiation. And it's a recognition that languages, customs, and ideas that appeared in ancient texts were not immediately translatable into our contemporary understanding of something. So the idea that misunderstanding is not rarefied, but rather a matter of course, would have remained simply a matter confined to textual studies, but for the field of philosophical hermeneutics, which arose in post-war France and Germany. And for those unfamiliar, this field takes the basic presupposition of what I just explained about misunderstanding as a matter of course in the world of the text. And it suggests that human consciousness itself interacts with the world in fundamentally the same way. Our understanding somehow creates meaning by bridging the gap between our fragmented experience of time and the colloquial meanings and ideas that allow us to communicate and live in society together. Such a philosophical perspective provided the West in the 20th century with one of the most progressive views of what it means to understand something. And it's still an active field today. And my point here is this: whether one accepts the basic kind of premise of philosophical hermeneutics or not, it illustrates to us that while the concept of understanding may have undergone a radical transformation in the 20th century, the basic notion of misunderstanding as a failure of understanding remained fairly stable. And here we come to a second intellectual historical point, which is really critical. Prior to the development of hermeneutics, the concept of misunderstanding is fundamentally inherited from debates about the mind-body problem that came out of the wake of René Descartes' Meditations and the larger period in early modern Europe. And notable among this was John Locke in his essay concerning human understanding. So Locke begins the essay with, I think, a critical distinction that's really interesting for this talk. And it marks a pronounced shift for both the concept of the understanding and misunderstanding. So he essentially says, and I'm paraphrasing very loosely here, that he says, look, I'm aware of the debates about the nature of the mind and the body and their relationship. And, these are of great interest, but I'm not going to engage in them. Instead, he says, I believe there's value in exploring the understanding in its own right. And it's interesting because Locke's often viewed as a key figure in empiricism. This basic distinction is actually fairly progressive. But I would argue that it's from this period of him writing in 1690 where our contemporary notion of misunderstanding occurs. And as a result, I want to highlight a few aspects of his view. So his basic assumption is this: understanding can be an error. Very simple. But the reason he says that is a little more complex. He says the error that occurs is not simply through a lack of knowledge. It's not that you didn't know or were ignorant of something. It's rather that somehow your understanding misjudges the information that you have in front of you. And he calls this process wrong assent, meaning that our understanding somehow gives a false or wrong agreement to an idea that's in front of us. So let me illustrate this by, think about a student struggling with a mathematical concept, like the Pythagorean theorem, probably a lot like I did in school. Or maybe perhaps a member of the public that doesn't understand how parliamentary representation works. Locke is not simply saying that our understanding doesn't connect up to the concept. He's suggesting our understanding does connect to the concept, and this would be that agreement or assent part, but somehow our understanding connects up incorrectly. And that somehow, in the case of the student, they've perhaps substituted a false concept in their attempt to comprehend the Pythagorean theorem. And that's what's providing this fundamental barrier to understanding. And the same would be the case for the member of the public. It's not that they don't have a concept of what parliamentary representation is at all. They've somehow given an agreement or an assent that's false to only a partially true concept of what parliamentary representation would be. So we're going to return to this idea a bit later in the talk. What's the important point here? Well, for me, the critical point is, obviously, we can see lots of different instances of understanding that don't occur in the way Locke describes it. I mean, maybe a student, for example, learning the Pythagorean theorem doesn't simply misjudge a particular concept. The student may just simply not understand. Perhaps they don't know what a triangle is, for example. Perhaps they haven't even heard of an equation. There's lots of reasons why they might not understand. There's different ways in which human cognition doesn't grasp the information in front of them. That doesn't strictly relate to this failure due to misjudging a concept and a false concept. But here's why this is interesting to me and why I dragged you through that long historical labyrinth. It's interesting because the associated network of concepts surrounding misunderstanding, whether it's words like misinformation, misjudgment, etc., and all the political and legal ramifications that seem to come with that, they fundamentally have to do with this idea of error. And so whether in a contemporary academic field like philosophical hermeneutics, or in the language of journalists, politicians, or members of the public, we, myself included, we unthinkingly invoke the idea of the understanding somehow not fully grasping the information in front of us. Why? Because somehow a false concept has been agreed to, and we must overcome it by implication. And that, I feel, is the critical problem. The implicit belief that misunderstanding must be overcome. So let me clarify something. It's a very dangerous sentence. Of course, I believe incorrect understanding must be challenged, and that we must have a way to be clear in our communication about the destructive forces we find both within ourselves and within society. This is not a plea for a radical relativism. So rather, what I'm trying to assert here is that when we see a misunderstanding, it is somehow deeply buried in our instinct to think of it as a false conception that we somehow have to overcome or combat. It's a built-in philosophy of voluntarism, perhaps, and that this provides a barrier to adequately addressing all the variety of forms in which cognition clearly doesn't grasp the information in front of it. And I'm going to return to this more in the final section. So I've provided a few historical ideas to talk about the history of this concept. And I want now to transition to that second word in the title of my talk, meaning. So the concept of meaning creation is often described as central to the study of linguistics, philosophy of language, philosophical hermeneutics. And it obviously is one of the broader themes of this word and worlds talk that we're currently a part of here at the Royal Institute. Just to clarify, the word meaning is, of course, different to that feeling of fulfillment or meaningfulness we talk about in terms of our lives, such as an existential meaning. Rather, broadly speaking, when I talk about meaning creation, I'm talking about why words make sense and why they register to us when we use them. Now, typically, in the study of linguistics, one way that linguists often divide the study of the creation of meaning is the difference between semantics and pragmatics. Semantics study the meaning of words and sentences, whereas pragmatics study the relationship between words, people, and context. And one thing they both share, however, is the acknowledgement that there is a difference between an ideal grammatical structure to language and the reality of colloquial communication. That's the realm where idioms, slang, figurative language, and colloquialisms exist and have distinct meanings to distinct people and groups. And it's really that world that I think misunderstanding occurs in and is perhaps most useful for us. Because the drivers of meaning changes are often reflected colloquially, I would say, rather than simply ideally. So to begin this section, let me highlight a few different concepts of how meaning changes in language. So first of all, changes to meaning is something that was historically viewed as having to do with etymology or the history of words. This is often called a diachronic approach, and while wildly popular in European academia up until the 19th century, fell out of favor with the introduction of Caesar's course on general linguistics, and more on that in a moment. But one of the key touchstones, and I would argue strengths, of the diachronic approach is its ability to trace the history of languages and the way in which languages change over time. So earlier, when we were talking about that presupposition in hermeneutics, this idea that we misunderstand things because of that gap between reader and text, hermeneutics is really drawing on this approach. And an arguably famous example I'll use is the change of the word philosophy. So from the Greek words philo, meaning love, and sophia, meaning wisdom. The Greek description of Socrates as a lover of wisdom has clearly gone through several shifts over hundreds and hundreds of years to give it the connotations it does today. When we speak of philosophy today, we could just as easily be describing a worldview, a viewpoint, or even something highly abstract, just in the same breath as we could be describing a pursuit of wisdom. The diachronic approach that studies these shifts of meaning does have strengths that are relevant for us today, I would argue, primarily because it provides evidence of how a particular language within a particular group of speakers can transform over long periods of time. And with this approach, we can see how certain words and concepts that are foundational to a culture come into being and transform. And this provides a vertical approach to the question of how meaning changes. There are limitations, however, as thinkers like Ferdinand Saussure saw, and one of them being that the vertical ascent is only showing one spot of the horizon going one direction. Because of this, as you may know, nowadays, linguistics has shifted towards a more synchronic approach, which values the assessment of language, not from the perspective of history, but from the perspective of the present. How language is spoken in a particular time and place, and what it means to those speakers. This shift has provided an incredibly rich history in the last 120 years. And whether it's prominence for 20th century philosophical movements such as deconstruction and post-structuralism, or perhaps its ability to provide a field like cognitive linguistics with rich collections of data of how communities use figurative language, this shift examines language in a synchronic manner has taught us new things about ourselves and about our use of language. The way the synchronic approach relates to meaning, however, is distinct and interesting. The development of the synchronic approach in Europe also coincided with it's sometimes referred to as the first modernity, the time when colonial empires were collapsing, the Industrial Revolution and mass production was in full swing, and suddenly much larger groups of people had access to certain basic things that only the very elite had access to before. Partially due to the collapse of empire, partially due to global war, and partially due to the changing world of work, the first modernity was also a time of both migration and immigration, as well as a time about a shifting understanding of non-Western languages and cultures. As a result, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by historical accident, reflections on meaning change in this period frequently drew on examples from ethnolinguistics and anthropology. Meaning change became measured by meaning shifting between cultural paradigms. And one of the byproducts of this, of course, is the empirical reality of relativism. That distinct meanings will definitely arise from distinct paradigms and perspectives. And as we attempt to understand speakers in this time and place, we see that our own colloquial meanings and understandings shift relative to different languages and cultural paradigms. So because of this, universal meanings were no longer simply European universal meanings, because the concept of the world widened. In my view, this was definitely an incredibly important moment in Europe's self-understanding. However, I would argue it also created a fundamental problem that we still have today. It created a template of measuring changes of meaning by relating them to the other, but neglected how meaning change might occur within a particular language and culture. So in attempting to combat what I would be considered to be empirically incorrect and often oppressive notions of European universality, it also created cross-cultural communications as a new kind of universality. And in doing so, the drivers of meaning change in this more synchronic model tends to be reduced to relativism. I believe cross-cultural communication is, of course, an extremely vital field of study. But to make it a template for all forms of meaning change both devalues the study itself and those other drivers of meaning change that exist. And I think finally it also runs the risk of unintentionally creating a hierarchical othering, this relationship between the language and the culture in question. So finally, we intuitively know that beyond the empirical reality of relativism, there can be darker forces at play in how meaning changes. On this note, one final model of meaning change is that of ideology. And this will help us to kind of make the link back to the concept of misunderstanding. So in the late 1960s, in his famous critique of philosophical hermeneutics, Jürgen Habermas wrote that misunderstandings can be systematically produced, particularly, he says, because it is possible for both tradition and systems of authority to change our own colloquial meanings and to use them against us. When he describes this, he suggests such meaning changes have been systematically produced through some kind of centralized effort. Because of this intentional meaning change that primarily benefits the keepers of tradition or systems of authority, misunderstandings are somehow sewn into the public mind. So think about the metaphor of the roaring lion to describe Great Britain, for example. Whether we like that as an image or not, it's one that several people in this country and around the world are basically familiar with. When that metaphor is used in a speech about the economy, however, and the roar of the lion is used to suggest a particular economic agenda, both our subconscious and conscious mind are activated, and the roaring lion takes on a distinct meaning. The meaning has been fashioned not through cross-cultural change or historic change, but rather through a system of authority. A somewhat benign example maybe, but one that speaks to Habermas's point, I think. This model of meaning change is readily familiar, and it's certainly one that reflects the historical realities Habermas was negotiating with when he wrote about it. Famously part of the Hitler Youth when he was young, and then undergoing a radical shift to become one of West Germany's greatest champions of democracy. The aftermath in the Second World War and denazification process clearly haunt this model that Habermas puts forward to us. There's an awareness in it of a centralized ministries of propaganda, for example. So it's certainly evident, I would say, that these kind of ideological meaning changes do exist. And while we do see some contemporary examples of them, such as Putin's war in Ukraine, not all contemporary meanings change brought about by ideology correspond to this systematic, centralized model that Habermas outlines. The journeys of ideas on social media, for example, is anything but centralized. If anything, it's a byproduct of a strange mixture of human behaviors and algorithms. But it cannot be reduced to a single individual or centralized propaganda office. So, as I kind of begin to move towards a close, I'm going to use a fascinating example of this that happened in the lead up to the storming of the US Capitol in 2021. As the vote for the US presidential election was being counted, and Donald Trump was famously making false claims about election fraud, a map put out by an official and legitimate vote tracking agency was showing votes being counted for both Biden and Trump in a particular county. Now, at one particular moment, as it was doing its updating and counting and tallying, there was a glitch. And that glitch lasted literally, I believe it was 5 seconds. But in the midst of the glitch, it showed a 100% surge for Biden and a 0% surge of votes for Trump. The glitch quickly fixed itself and it went back to the regular tally. However, someone took a screenshot of that glitch with the 100% surge for Biden. It was then uploaded onto a far-right message board. It was in fact one run by the now infamous QAnon. And it slowly began to make its way onto Twitter. The BBC actually ran a really interesting article about this and the way in which it made a journey from the far outer reaches of Twitter through to increasingly prominent profiles, all the way to Donald Trump's Twitter account. He then retweeted it as evidence of one of his many false claims of election fraud. What's my point here? Well, there's obviously no question that this is misinformation and generated a misunderstanding with dire consequences. It's one of the pieces of evidence that people that stormed the Capitol used. It also highlights meaning change because the map was indeed some kind of legitimate official vote counting source and thus represented some kind of authority in the minds of people. However, that's where the similarity with Habermas's ideological model stops. What interests me about this incident, of course, is there's obviously several parallels in the last 10 years. And what interests me about this was it wasn't for Trump's grand propaganda machine that created a misunderstanding. The relationship between meaning change and misunderstanding here is actually generated by a hybrid of new technologies and new forms of human communication. In her much lauded work, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff highlights the way in which humans relate to searching for information and the way that that's fundamentally changed since the first modernity that I talked about a moment ago. So while mass production and people have continued and expanded, the new internet-based technology, she argues, such as Twitter, have led to a sociological shift by which we all, not just members of extremist political groups, but all of us as humans in the internet age, fundamentally process understandings and searches for information in a different way. So she uses, very interesting, the word search as an example of this. And she talks about the fact that when we tend to search for information by simply swiping or clicking, we're doing it to an answer that somehow already exists, as opposed to discovering something previously unknown. So her kind of idea is the way this word search has transformed in this second modernity. And the fact that this process of gaining understanding is radically uncentralized due to the nature of social media means that misunderstandings generated are different to those in the first modernity. They are not reducible simply to a failure of understanding, nor to simply some kind of relative cross-cultural understanding, or even, as we have just seen, to an ideological misunderstanding. It suggests to us a distinct type of ideological misunderstanding, and one which we don't fully have a model to comprehend yet, I would suggest. Rather, our age suggests to us a distinct type of the way in which misunderstandings and meanings change and interact. So let me now draw to a conclusion. Because of the new type of meaning change that is facilitated through new technology, the way that we give our agreement to knowledge has shifted. The question then is, are we misjudging knowledge? And what would that even mean with the rapidity and speed of which we are introduced to new knowledge? We don't have time even for a search, because truth is found simply when we swipe right. The combination of the distinct types of ideological misunderstanding we see today, the way in which new technology affects our understanding and meaning change, and the heritage of Locke's notion of misunderstanding as wrong assent, and by implication something which we must overcome, is a very dangerous cocktail. And it's a cocktail I would suggest we're still in the process of mixing. On their own, each concept works within a certain realm, and we can see their usefulness. Together, however, it relies on and builds on a series of assumptions that we often weaponize, either misunderstanding or meaning change. And so what does the fact that misunderstanding is ultimately tied to meaning change mean for the concept of misunderstanding today? Especially because it's in our historical moment, these phenomenons, as we've seen, are so altered from the previous assumptions. So I'm going to conclude with a rather poetic image. It's this recurring image of Viking bones in Seamus Heaney's collection of poems, North. And hopefully they'll provide a concluding analogy that will give us an idea of a possible route forward. So in the poems, Heaney mirrors the violence surrounding the Troubles in Northern Ireland with the violence of the Viking Age, and the heritage of that violence buried deep within the soil of the UK and Ireland. The bones in this collection of poems are always presented as bleached, brittle, and deteriorated. They're transformed and altered by time so that any suggestion of the former body's personality remains mysterious, even mystical. Yet, despite this transformation, the bones always seem to leave an impression. Their yellowed imprint lingers in the grass, or they have somehow altered the formation and the character of the soil around them. Misunderstanding, I feel, operates a bit like this. On the one hand, as an error of understanding, it seems far removed and altered from a correct or originary meaning. On the other hand, however, misunderstanding seems to leave a mark, shaping the contemporary context of the discourse community where it occurs. Like the bones that are transformed, altered, and disconnected from their former bodies' personalities, the change of meaning that misunderstandings undergo is often disconnected from understanding. And as public discourse rages, we lament and miss it. Yet in our age, the imprint of error suggests to us that incorrect understanding is actually shaped by multiple forces in the same way that as a Viking burial decomposes in the soil, and several factors, whether that's weather, the soil, or the passage of time, all come together to shape the landscape. So too does misunderstanding of our age arise from multiple sources. The old methods of overcoming misunderstandings, just like the old methods of Viking warfare, may not be suitable for our time. So what I'm suggesting here in conclusion, albeit somewhat poetically, is that we need a model of misunderstanding and meaning change that on the one hand preserves some notion of a correct understanding, but on the other hand, does not simply try to overcome all misunderstandings, as they are in error. As we saw earlier in Locke's model, where understanding connects to something incorrectly, it's helpful, but fundamentally limited. So today, the meaning changes that shape misunderstanding cannot be simply overcome by an assault on a centralized source. So we need a model of misunderstanding, I would argue, that preserves a form of correct understanding, while at the same time is critically aware of the fact that meaning change is operating from multiple decentralized sources. And I would argue that this is essential for the future of both philosophical reflections on this topic and in civic life, because it's not simply a theoretical reflection confined to a brilliant but distinct treatise from 1689. Rather, the very future of the public sphere is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've got a half hour or so for questions. Over to you. Yes, at the back.
Thank you very much. I was trying to think what you meant by understanding. If you talk about understanding parliamentary democracy, and I could just conceive of it as a set of statements. If you were asked to say what your understanding was, you would give just a set of statements and maybe some, counterfactual conditionals or so forth. And then incorrect understanding would be that some of those statements were false. Is that how you would conceive of the understanding of a complex concept?
Do you mean specifically in relation to a complex concept that has an actual real lived place, like the parliament, or do you mean more broadly?
I think more broadly.
It's a really good question, and I think it would probably take an entire talk or several talks to think more in depth about how we would acknowledge understanding. I think perhaps your model that you've just said that seems absolutely fine to me. I think the heart of my talk was attempting to challenge the distinction between understanding and misunderstanding, not because I didn't want that kind of set of statements that you could then acknowledge, but rather because the way we evaluate misunderstanding seems to somehow only be in the negative of that concept of understanding. So I think your model sounds absolutely fine, but I would want to explore more in depth how misunderstanding would be connected to that, because my concern is that it's just simply this add-on as a concept. Does that make a bit more sense?
Yeah, misunderstanding is not just that you've got some of those statements false when they should be true.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
It's more than that. So, and I'm sure you explained it was more than that, but I didn't hold that all in my head. So if it's not just that some of the statements were false, what is it?
Yeah, good. Thank you for making me clarify my own point. I think what I would suggest is at least, so I would say there's probably more, but there's at least 3 different types of misunderstanding, or 4 now. But the first would be Simply, the statements are false, the failure of understanding. The second is that model of meaning change I talked about, relative misunderstanding, where you say a word or do an action that just doesn't immediately translate across a language or a culture. And then the third would be when somebody intentionally creates a misunderstanding. So it's not that we got it wrong, but we didn't have a chance to get it right in the first place. So I would say those are at least three different types, and so it's difficult to just create one meaning. On the other hand, to make my answer short, I think that what I was also trying to suggest is today, we can't say either three of those really are the focus. There's a fourth type that we're seeing of misunderstanding. And hopefully, if I wasn't clear, to say it again more clearly, that fourth type is that meaning is changing very quickly within the same language, but it doesn't have that long historical change I necessarily talked about. It's very rapid because of the speed and the decentralization of social media.
So it's not really it starts with a little bit of context and then it's a question.
Sure.
But I was just thinking, you mentioned how in sort of the climate of social media communications, right, we have this decentralized structure of meaning making and of misunderstanding making. So I was thinking, like, for example, you look at different formats in the creator economy, you look at Instagram Reels, you look at TikTok replies, and we see how we are sort of multiplying and cannibalizing content. And I was just wondering, how is this generation of misunderstanding and multiplication of potential misunderstanding, how is that working into your proposal for a new model of understanding, if at all?
Okay. So let me just make sure I understood your question correctly. So you've given me a really good example of TikTok and all these things that are way beyond me, so thank you. A decentralized structure of meaning making. But you're asking, how is that decentralized structure working into my model?
Yeah. So for example, I can give you like an example, like someone says, someone is issuing a misunderstanding in whatever format.
Sure.
Someone else is copying that misunderstanding and then creating a little bit of something else on top.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I think that's something I'm still trying to figure out, and I hope that that people like yourself are also trying to figure out, because I think that's why I use the word, it's a cocktail we're still mixing. And I think that my suggestion, when I use the example of how that screen grab of that glitch then got retweeted by Trump eventually, I mean, that kind of highlights a similar aspect of what you're talking about, is there's layers and layers of like meanings being generated there. I don't think we have a clear model for that, and so I would love to hear from others, because I think that's something that I'm essentially proposing that we need to reflect on more if we're going to try to understand this crisis of communication that we seem to have in our age. So I don't have an answer, but I think that I'm proposing that we need one desperately. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, at the front.
Cheers. Thank you for that talk, really informative. I was wondering, it's a bit of a side question really, but whether you'd just like to riff on the relationship between mean, means and meaning and how they come into play together.
My short answer is no, because I'm not cool enough to understand memes.
Sorry, not memes.
Oh, right.
Mean, although that kind of relates to you, but mean, means and meaning.
So mean as in the mathematical concept, or mean as in I'm mean to you? Or?
Not the latter, yeah, the first, I guess.
Okay.
The first. The relational mean.
Yeah. Do you know what? I don't know. That's something I'll have to think about.
That's okay. I thought it was a bit.
You can catch me afterwards, and I'll have a think about that. Thank you.
Okay, so we're getting a little bit of a cue here. So 1, 2, 3, please.
You mentioned a crisis of communication, and what do you see as being the potential resulting negative impact of this crisis?
So what's the negative impact of the crisis? Okay.
How is this crisis manifesting, and
Yeah.
where are we experiencing its problems in our lives?
Okay, so I don't have a perfect answer, but let me use a few examples that come to mind. I'm going to use a really simple answer. So the morning after the Brexit vote, for example, I remember that there was a friend of the family whose mum came to them in tears and basically said, "Am I racist because I voted for Brexit?" And the moment there of a person thinking they voted for a particular reason, but then being confronted with another possible reason that related to their identity, is a great example of the fissure we've seen in our country over the last 10 years or so. And so whether it's very personal examples like that, where people would say, "I thought I was conservative, but I'm not that kind of conservative. I thought I was Labour, but I'm not that kind of Labour," which we've seen over and over and over again, the parties fissuring. That would be one example of the negative impact of this crisis of communication, all the way up to examples like I tried to highlight of the fact that people stormed the Capitol in the United States because they were getting fed misinformation, but it wasn't as simple as they all read a propaganda sheet produced by a centralized place. And so I think most of the things I see in the headlines are part of the negative impact of this crisis of communication. That's a bit of an overstatement, but there's certainly several examples. Does that answer your question a bit more?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, and then over here, please.
Thank you, sir. You have mentioned linguistic and misunderstanding, and my question is, what does language play in the role of misunderstanding, and is it likely to mitigate or eliminate misunderstanding through the unification of language? For example, because I kind of read the Bible, so the construction of Babel Tower, is that kind of an effort to eliminate the misunderstanding to some kind of degrees? I don't know whether the instance makes sense. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your question. That's a really interesting question. I can't probably provide a full answer, but I think the Tower of Babel, I don't know why I didn't even think of that as a fantastic example particularly for that second type of misunderstanding that I talked about, that relative misunderstanding. I think what I probably can answer, what role does language play, like you said. I think what I was trying to get at is the fact that misunderstanding often happens when, if you put a word, and I'm just going to use the word democracy because we talked about that a bit, you put a word out there, and people tend to have an idea of what they think something like democracy means. The misunderstanding then occurs because somehow we find that there's multiple meanings of the same word. And that's, I would say, the relationship between misunderstanding and language often, is that we seem to find that a particular word doesn't mean what we thought it did. And I'm just using the example of politics and these bigger social issues as one example. But I think more broadly, that's one of the ways in which misunderstandings in language occur. It's not the only way, but it's one of the ways. So hopefully that answers a little bit. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I guess I'm wondering, with the growing school of thought of decolonialism as it's moving up, and the existence of, or the struggle to fight this dominance of certain knowledges and certain understandings over others, how does your model of misunderstandings accord for authority and having certain schools of thoughts or certain branches of the world feel like they have a certain authority over understanding and then coming forward misunderstanding? And how do we reconcile that with decolonialism's attitude towards plurality of truth, plurality of meanings and understandings?
It's a really easy question then, basically. No, that's a very difficult question, and thank you so much for it. In some ways, I would say it's actually an answer like I gave over here, that it's something I think is imperative and I'm trying to figure out, and I want others to try to figure out with me. The thing that popped in my head that I was trying to highlight towards the end was quite often, as you may know, some of the intellectual backdrop for decolonial thought would rest on ideas like Habermas's about how colloquial communication can then be used against one. And as I've tried to highlight, although I was doing it specifically about Western democracy, I don't think that fully accounts for some of the problems. And while I used the example of the way that the internet changes meaning in something like an election, for example, I would probably say the same thing is the case if we move outside of that, because my concern is fundamentally that the model of misunderstanding that we have in this kind of ideological misunderstanding model of we've been fed false information, but we don't fully realize it at first. On the one hand, is very much about a centralized power structure, which certainly is important in a decolonial model. But on the other hand, as you have rightly pointed out, there is an increasing fissure in the world, an increasing breakdown of the colonial structure, and yet we find that there's still aspects of the colonial structure in place, so that there is one model. I think what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way, I'm not sure if one size fits all, and that's why I feel like a critique of a model like Habermas's that would be so prevalent in decolonial theory would perhaps need to be rethought in order to better address the problems you're talking about. It's not a perfect answer, but there's just some thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. So my question is, following post-truth being known as the word of the year in 2016, I think, by the Oxford English Dictionary, lots of versions of the word post-truth has sprung up in different languages. For example, in Chinese, Spanish, German. So my first question is, given that all these different countries have different political cultures and also media, will they be able to capture the essence of the meaning of post-truth that the OED considered? And if not, how will we be able to combat all these different and nuanced versions of misconceptions and the intentional generation of misconceptions?
Let me make sure I understood your question. Are you saying the essence of the meaning of post-truth in multiple languages? Mm-hmm. Is that the heart of your question?
Sorry.
No, it was a good question. Okay. Again, a very, very, very easy question. I think that I don't have a perfect answer to this. One of the things that pops in my head is that there's really two answers. Because on the one hand, you're asking this much bigger question about translation, aren't you? About the way in which, can we ever fully translate between different languages? And that's this massive question that I think has no real conclusion that people have been reflecting on, for ages and ages. On the other hand, I think there is a question about, there is some concrete things you can look at, like cultural reception, structures of authority that relate to the particular cultures in which the word is translated, and that will affect the meaning. So I suppose what it makes me think of, actually, is that there's probably no perfect way to translate a word like that. But what I keep coming back to when I'm kind of thinking about these questions recently is I think there's probably something quite important about lived experience. So while the word post-truth might not perfectly translate, it does strike me that I could have a conversation with somebody speaking a very different language about a lived experience of something like post-truth. And I think that's probably a better point for conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, here we are in the middle.
Oh, hi there, Andrew. Thanks for your talk. Very interesting. I might be a bit behind the curve here, but I'm still thinking about this idea about whether there is something common to understanding and all forms of understanding, and also common to misunderstanding. So the first gentleman was saying one model is that you have true statements and you have false statements, and obviously then there is this clear idea of misunderstanding that can be corrected. I was thinking something more along the lines of something more relative. So here's my kind of simple idea, which might kind of put other things into context, is that everything that we see everything here is like certain things, and it's also unlike other things. So this is not an original idea by any means. So really, if things are like certain things and unlike other things, then we can also make a misjudgment. So we think that something is like something, but it actually isn't like that thing, or isn't like other things. Or we can say something isn't like something, but in actual fact it is. So from that perspective, given that everything is relative, and there's so many ways in which things are like certain things and unlike other things, then when it comes to understanding itself, that understanding is relative. Now, there's a slightly bigger question here, that if there are absolutes, then you could say that certain things are like absolutes. But that's a kind of a slightly more progressive metaphysical conversation. How does that strike you in terms of the context of the things that you've been saying about, there isn't, right understanding. It's not something that needs to be corrected, or that there's context that changes because we're in societies that change, or that people are misusing these ideas of meaning. It's all just kind of relative. Does that make sense?
You might need to repeat the second part one more time. So I don't think you're behind the curve at all. I think it's very fundamental questions you're asking. I got slightly lost with the "isn't like something, but in fact it is" bit. Could you repeat that?
Say for example, we think the sun is it's like an orange,
yes.
or it's like a light bulb. But there's many ways in which the sun isn't like an orange and isn't like a light bulb.
Yep.
And when we misjudge things, we think that it's like something that it isn't, or it's different from something that it is actually like.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I think, in a really, really simple answer, again, these are just endless questions that I probably couldn't sum up right now, but the very simple answer would be, when you use that word, we misjudge things. There's, for me, how I understand that is, on the one hand, it's very useful to think in that way, but that implies an entire model, an entire heritage of thinking about what misjudgment means. And so I'm not trying to kind of hide behind some kind of, historical relativist argument. I think what I'm saying is, when you use those words, that we misjudge something, that it implies something about error, and I'm suggesting that incorrect understanding isn't equatable to error. I think that's probably the best I can answer your question. So at the heart of it, I'm saying incorrect understanding is not always equatable to error, and I'm kind of questioning that, maybe. I don't have an answer, but I'm questioning that relationship.
Yeah, so it's clear that nothing is like, is going to always be like something, and there's no those sort of absolutes in that respect, right? That's kind of what I was getting at, which is similar to what you were arguing. It's inherently in the sort of process of understanding and misunderstanding. We're continually comparing things together, and seeing that they're the same and different to other things. So it's never going to be, unless the thing is that the thing you're comparing to, is it the thing itself? It's never going to be always exactly similar to it.
Yeah, and I think just in conclusion to your question, I think I agree with that. I think the problem, though, with that is, obviously we live in an age, as has been pointed out, whether it's issues relating to decolonization or whether it's issues relating to the crisis of the internet and politics, is that we need to be able to speak more precisely with things. Because I'm the idea of that bigger picture idea of relativism really appeals to me. It doesn't necessarily always work when it comes to making just societies. And so I think that's the crisis, really.
Thank you.
Thanks again for your talk. So I guess I'm trying to drill down into it. And it feels like, for me, the question isn't like, how have you misunderstood this, but like, what do you understand by this? So essentially I was just like clarifying on that.
That's an excellent way to put it. Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it. I think that's the beginning of one solution, is going, okay, what do you understand by this? And that's a starting point, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because for me, it was like, okay, well, if we're saying that meaning isn't equated, if we're saying that people's understanding of meaning doesn't equate to necessarily like
positive or a negative or false.
Yeah.
It's just that we're all coming from completely different cultural contexts. And so understanding first what someone understands by a concept is how we can, I don't know what the next step is.
Yeah, and I would, but I think that's put really well. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, yeah.
I'm just wondering if we could flip the misunderstandings to what do you think are the advantages of misunderstandings? And maybe if you can split them by the different types of misunderstandings.
Okay. I think there's a lot of advantages of misunderstanding, and that's actually, I failed to talk about how there's a real tradition about productive misunderstandings. I mean, some of the advantages of misunderstanding, because I'm obviously using quite intense, dire examples about things that lead people to, storm buildings and people die, and these are obviously severe examples. Some of the advantages of misunderstanding are the challenge to our own understanding. So let me use a really simple example that's quite silly. On my way here, I was rushing, and my head was in trying to prepare for this, and I was like, I haven't read it through enough times. And I'm going across the crosswalk, and I'm looking at the big Harry Potter play at whatever place that is, and I just feel something brush against my leg, and I immediately kind of just get really frustrated, because I'm like, why has somebody just run into me? And then I suddenly realized I totally misunderstood what happened, because actually I ran into somebody's dog. And I was terrified, and I was like chasing the person, like, oh my goodness, is your dog okay, And there was a great moment for me to have to challenge fundamentally what I thought I understood. So misunderstandings provide enormous advantages in that regards, and I think that's probably one of the biggest ones. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Thank you. This is kind of bouncing off of the last person's question. Thank you, because I wasn't going to say anything until he's made that point. Moving away from politics, I was kind of using music as an approach to your talk today in terms of a possibly positive approach to misunderstanding. And I was thinking of a group of people could listen to a song at one time, and because of their lived experiences, come away with completely different interpretations of that song. And there's beauty in that, because that song could provide sentimental value to someone else, or it could be bittersweet to another person. And I don't know if that's inherently a bad thing for, in terms of music. I know you were talking about politics and how scary that can all be, but I couldn't help but apply music and a song to what you were saying. So
yeah, no, thanks for that. I think music's a really interesting example, because I think the example you gave, I kind of wonder, is that a misunderstanding, or is it just like different experiences? Because what would the correct understanding of a song even be? And so I think sometimes maybe misunderstanding isn't even the best term to describe the multiplicity of experiences we have. On the other hand, I can think of there's musicians that are very playful sometimes with struggling to think of the 20th century French composer who does the bird songs, for example. And there's an aspect of mimicry sometimes where you think you're hearing a particular sound and you might interpret it one way, but then you realize it's something else. And I think that can be a really productive and deepening experience, a kind of an aesthetic experience as well. So I think misunderstandings can be used really productively in music that deepen our kind of understanding of the world and of a song and everything. So yeah, thank you for your comment.
Okay, so first of all at the front, and then in the middle towards the... yeah, please.
Yeah, literally, thank you so much for your talk, but literally building on this last comment about misunderstanding being a good thing because everyone has their own lived experience, I'm wondering why this concept of misunderstanding being positive cannot be expanded to a wider set of fields and topics, because otherwise it sounds like, well, this is emotional, misunderstandings are fine, but on politics, misunderstanding are not fine. That sounds pretty arbitrary to me. And that's why I'm wondering, and maybe building on the gentleman's question is, well, it's very hard to get something which is as a meaning fully recognized by anyone else. So I'm really questioning what the actual there's nothing which is maybe in my opinion, but then it's an opinion again. There's nothing which is absolute probably, and it becomes very hard to have a common understanding. Common understanding of that. Therefore, I believe the example of music could possibly be expanded to other fields. But what's your thoughts on that?
I think so this is what it initially makes me think of. Makes me think of this dilemma I always have, which is I'm basically like really enjoy multiple kinds of music. I'm very eclectic in my music taste. One day I'm interested in heavy metal, the next day I'm interested in classical, the next day I'm interested in hip hop. And I don't know if misunderstanding happens there as much as it's more just the eclecticism of the varieties of life. And we've a lot of people are talking about the kind of the relative aspect of experience. My problem I tend to have, though, is I'm like, wouldn't it just be great if we could all just kind of, share experiences and, as we've talked about, realize what we actually are understanding by something in the first place. I can extend that so far, and then I bump up against somebody posting something on a far-right message board and Donald Trump retweeting it. And I feel like at the end of the day, I'm not sure how far I can extend the relative model. That's my problem. Because while I like that in terms of my own personal experience, whether it's to do with music or food or travel or kind of philosophy, at the same time, there becomes this problem that happens when I'm like, how far can I go until I say, that's fundamentally destroying society. And I'm not sure whether I want to hold on to relativism so much that I want to see society destroyed. So I think that's my dilemma.
I fully get your point, and I think, again, it becomes your understanding of what destruction society. Eventually you can go on, and it's a very relative and destructive thought, mine. But your understanding of what justice is, or what destruction of society is your understanding of it, and very likely or sadly is not shared by everyone. That's why it becomes very hard to get. There is an understanding, and therefore there are misunderstandings to it. And that's also what I'm facing personally. I agree with you. It's very hard to say how far can we go with this relative approach, but that's the struggle, I guess. So I'm glad that people are thinking of it.
Yes, yeah.
And as you said, I like the approach that invite people to think about it, because I think eventually it will be a middle ground where everyone probably converge.
Yeah, thank you.
So the lady in green towards the back in the middle.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I was wondering whether you think maybe agency with social media if you think it has an impact, or whether you think if it does, what kind of impact? I'm thinking specifically that I think there might be a difference between the four types of misunderstanding that you said. So if somebody in the street asks me about a term and I misunderstand it because I don't quite know what it is, or if somebody has a slightly relative understanding of something, or if there's a ideological manipulation, none of these I have much to do with. But with social media, I choose who I follow, and I create my newsroom. I create my. I know echo chamber isn't quite the right word, but that's a kind of misunderstanding itself. But I think you know what I mean. I create my own space in which to perpetuate my own understanding and misunderstanding in a way that I don't with all these other things. I was wondering what you think. Also, on another note, I think the composer you were thinking of might be Olivier Messiaen.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, Messiaen. Thank you. Yes, thank you for saving me there from not remembering Messiaen. Yeah, so I think what comes to mind when you say that is that what you've just described is a perfect example of the way in which I'm saying misunderstandings are created in this kind of fourth model that we need to explore more. And what it makes me think of, I would really recommend Zuboff's Age of Surveillance Capitalism, because she talks about in the beginning this idea of the word search. And she says the reason that searching for something shifts in what she calls the second modernity is exactly what you just talked about. And she begins the second modernity, and she's kind of putting this sociological analysis of the rise of social media, right? And she says the beginning of the second modernity fundamentally occurs with the launch of iTunes. And it's essentially fills the void that Napster had created. And the launch of iTunes suddenly allows people to customize the playlist for themselves in the same way that you say you curate your own newsroom. And so I think it's not just you. I would, I guess, agree with Zuboff that this is a broader sociological phenomenon that I myself experience. And so it makes us, search, when we actually search for things and we search for news or music, are we expanding our understanding? Is our understanding challenged at all? And on the one hand, you could say that needs to be something we actively do. But on the other hand, I don't know how much we actually can, because it's so much a part of the fabric of our lives to the extent that there's probably ways in which it affects me I don't even realize. So I think you've given a perfect example, actually, of the milieu in which misunderstanding does form today. So I don't know if it's a question or a reply as much as a comment saying, thank you, it's a good example, yeah.
There's a question right, in fact, there are now two questions right over at the back, so very back row, almost by the coat hangers.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by a lot of what you said, especially with Zuboff. Thinking about the search element, I was intrigued to ask how much of search is linked to reinforcement. So, for example, we can be quite tribalistic with our politics. What we maybe seek is to prove our own points as to what is correct and what is not correct. So that was one element I was thinking of. And the other element that I was going to ask about, they're quite brief questions. Meaning and the aspect of, what is not meaningful. Can we ever fully understand something with the living and, breathing nature of how truth kind of shifts all the time? Is there ever a full element of us fully understanding?
Okay.
Thanks.
Right. Thank you so much. That, again, a very easy question. No, and to be quick, I don't think we can ever fully understand something. That would be my own view on that. I think there's a comment by, I think it was Hans-Georg Gadamer, who said, the more I study philosophy, the more I realize I'm not God. And whether one believes in God, I think the point of that comment is fundamentally we'll never fully understand something. And I'm in agreement with him on that. In relation to this idea of search and how it might reinforce misunderstandings, I think actually that's where sometimes we do need to use that first model of misunderstanding, the error model, because the way in which we've all been talking about social media works, it does reinforce when our understanding might be in error. And so I think sometimes, maybe I'm obviously arguing for this very different model of misunderstanding, but sometimes we need to take what's good from that first model and be like, something's in error, and we're reinforcing it by the way in which our search parameters are an echo chamber, as it were. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
And then now one row forward, yeah.
Hello, and thanks for your speak. I would like to ask, so hermeneutics are based on, the word is a Greek word, which is from ερμηνευτική, which goes back to know, which means thinking. Is there space on your theories regarding perception and generally cognition? And also, what's your position regarding to ideas of perception that are around the Gestalt theory and maybe this German type of philosophy?
I think there's two questions there. I'm not sure if I have time to answer the relationship to Gestalt theory. It's a really interesting question, but so I probably don't have time to answer that right now. The first one about perception and recognition. What comes to mind, and something I've said to several of my students sometimes, is, okay, you're making a claim about something happening in society. On what level are you making that claim? And what I mean by that is, particularly when it comes to a misunderstanding, if a misunderstanding occurs, is it happening at the basic level of our perception, recognizing something as false? Or is it happening on a level when we actually kind of develop our thoughts on that and we begin to think more systematically, theoretically? And I think there are two fundamentally different levels, and I probably need to do more reading on how they relate. I'm still thinking about how those levels relate, because I think that's another aspect that I didn't go into in my talk of why misunderstanding and meaning are so tricky, because there are these two different levels. One, that basic level of misperceiving, but the other level of misunderstanding and having thought about it a bit. I don't know if that helps answer your question a bit, but yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
I think, yes, right at the front here.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. You said about the error misunderstanding and how it reinforces, how it's reinforced by social media. Do you think that's caused polarization within like politics? And how do you think that truly affects the negative effects of misunderstanding?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the short answer is it absolutely does affect politics. And are you asking the way in which that reinforces the negative aspects of misunderstanding?
Yeah, and do you think there could be any positive aspects that come from the reinforcement of certain ideas that people hold, rather than challenging?
Okay, interesting. Yeah. That's a really interesting question. What do you think?
I think, personally, I believe that social media companies have a duty to create, like, conversations. So even if that's not feeding people their own personal ideas, just having the challenge and being able to examine your thought on something can make you really expand your perspective. And I think that's really valuable.
Good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. In short, yeah, thank you for that. I think I agree to it mostly. I think what I would say maybe is that the way I'm thinking about this isn't necessarily whether or not social media is good or bad. It's more of it's not about accept or reject, good or bad. It's rather kind of the acknowledgement of it's there. And so for me, when I talk about building these models of misunderstanding, I'm trying to say not that we need to reject social media as a part of that or accept it, but rather incorporate the fact that it is there and it shapes our understanding, even if we're not users of it. Because when I read the BBC online and I click a link, suddenly I get taken to Twitter. I think that's probably more the level I'm reflecting on these things. So I agree with you to a certain extent, but I also think it's not about accept or reject. It's kind of, say you have a relative who leaves you a suitcase in the attic, and it's never going to go away until you go up and open it. And so it's not about do we chuck out the suitcase or do we keep it or whatever. It's like the suitcase is there, the letters are in there, the old records are in there. Let's open it up and try to think about it.
How would you incorporate misunderstanding into a social media model?
I think that's something, as I've mentioned before, I think I'm still thinking about, and I don't have a full answer right now, and I'm still working on and thinking about. So, I'll be curious to hear your answers in a few years' time as well. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's take you first, and then we'll have you, and then I'm going to ask a question, and I think we need to stop.
Thank you very much. I'm just interested to hear your opinion of how institutions play a role in managing misunderstanding.
I probably don't have a one-word answer. I think maybe I was talking about this dilemma earlier of kind of, well, I like a lot of the aspects of recognizing relativism as a part of human experience. On the other hand, I get concerned that if I accept so many things that fundamentally we end up destroying society. And so institutions playing a role, I don't have a clear-cut answer, but I think that's probably one of the reasons why this question needs to be reevaluated, because I do think institutions need to have a role. So I think, for example, social media organizations have a very critical role in providing some sort of ethical boundaries, even more than they do now. But I think that's also probably one of the most hotly contested topics. I know that, for example, is it online harms bill that went through the House of Lords recently? I mean, that took so much time because of the basic issues between, on the one hand, issues related to freedom of speech, on the other hand, issues related to ethics. And so I'm essentially trying to say that I'm trying to figure these things out too, because I don't think we have a clear-cut answer. And I'm highlighting that we don't have a clear-cut answer because some of the things we thought we knew about institution and misunderstandings have shifted. And that's why I'm saying we need to explore it more. But yeah, in short, I agree that institutions need to have a role in stopping the destruction of society.
On that question of the role of institutions, and I guess in kind of truth and meaning, there's The Constitution of Knowledge by Jonathan Rauch, which came out last year, I thought was an excellent on that particular topic. But my question was around emotion identity. So you talked about the people storming the Capitol. And that wasn't because they kind of dispassionately misunderstood things they saw on social media. They were very angry. And I think part of that anger would to do with questions of identity. They saw themselves as conservative Republicans, as true Americans, and various other things. And I wondered what your thoughts were on how much identity and self-narrative has to do with these misunderstandings which are being played upon and created in kind of political causes.
I would respectfully disagree with that distinction, because I think misinformation and misunderstanding played a direct role into the emotional identity of those individuals. And I think it's an echo chamber between the two. And so I don't think you can separate those two out. And I think there was lots of examples of the way in which you're absolutely right. I completely agree that emotion and narratives of identity played a huge role into some of those events and other events around the world. But at the same time, I fundamentally think that part of what plays into that narrative is the information that we are misjudging.
Right. No, I agree with that, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're nearly at the close, so I'm going to squeeze in my question. So philosophers of an analytic stripe are inclined to sort of put meaning on one side of a divide and truth and belief on the other side. And as I understood it, your talk was trying to really break down that divide and complicate the relationship between those things. So here's an example which I'd like you to respond to, which suggests that the divide is still in one piece. And I was thinking about your example of the split-second glitch in the vote count, which then gets tweeted as evidence that the vote is being manipulated. So you might say that in order to mislead somebody, meaning needs to be functioning absolutely smoothly. So, because in order to mislead you, to cause you voluntarily to form a belief that I know is false, I need to use words in a way I can be sure you understand the same way as me. So the problems all lie on the side of unshared beliefs, unshared knowledge, different standards of evidence, but meaning is working in the good old-fashioned way as this sort of shared, transparent medium of communication. How would you respond to that in the case of deliberately misleading people?
I think for me, it's a very good question. I think for me, in all honesty, it might come down to just a fundamentally different paradigm. So I would want to collapse the distinction between meaning, truth, and belief. However, the reason for that is not because I think that analytic philosophy must be on one side and what we call continental must be on the other. Rather, it's because that I'm not sure that meaning has any value if it's outside the world of what I would call colloquial communication. And that's when you talk about we use words that you understand the same as me in order to retweet these things and create the misunderstanding. To me, that only happens once words are colloquialized, and which is a process that happens long before we even begin to have that discussion and tweet these tweets. And so I think it might come down to just a fundamentally a paradigm that rests on that, a deep belief I have about the nature of communication, that fundamentally for meaning to make sense, we have to understand it as colloquial. So that's probably how I would respond to that.
Good. Thank you very much. And thank you for everything. And thanks indeed to you all for your participation.